Good.
Well, welcome. Hello. I'm excited we get
Thank
to have
you.
this chat tonight. I feel like, especially with the hellscape that is America right now, that if there was ever a time to support queer youth, it's currently.
Yes, and they need to know that we support them.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm excited to talk about all of it. Before we get into it, why don't you just introduce yourself for anyone who may be on who doesn't know you and your work?
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Erica, and I am a sex educator, and that means a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. Part of what I do currently is work with people who were raised in purity culture to give them the sex education that they didn't receive when they should have. But my career has been quite long, and I have done everything from support LGBTQ youth, including trans youth, for 20 years now, and worked in abortion care. Currently work with trans and gender nonconforming youth at a hospital gender clinic, and also, gosh, what else? Sex ed for youth in detention. Lots of different things. But right now, I mostly work with folks raised in purity culture and also queer youth and their families.
Amazing. Yeah, well, I immediately thought of you when I was thinking about this topic because something that happens to me a lot is that I have random parents reach out to me and
Yes.
they'll be like, hey, my child just came out to me as gay or trans or any other number of things in the LGBTQ umbrella. And they're like, I don't know what to do. Like,
Yeah.
they're like, do you do coaching around this? Like, can you help me? And it's not that I don't, it's just that I do more limited work in that area. And I'm always like, let me refer you to my friend Erica because she has a lot of experience with this that I don't have and does consultations around this.
Yes,
And
and
maybe
I
I
you
can
have sent work my way. You've
Yeah,
sent some pretty amazing families my way.
I know. And it just makes me so happy because I want nothing like, because for myself growing up, with the parents that I had and the family that I had, where the LGBTQ competency wasn't so much there,
Hmm.
with my experiences growing up and even now as an adult, it makes me so happy when I hear from parents who are like, I want to do the right thing. Like, I want to
Yes.
support my kid. No one ever taught me how. So I'm
Yes.
not sure what to do. And I'm like, that's fair. Like, there's no handbook for this.
No, I mean, increasingly there are resources, but when it's especially when it happens in a family, and this is something I see a lot, say a family where the parents are used to being pretty normative. So you
Mhm.
have a straight cis couple. A lot of times they've never been the other in any situation, especially if they're like a straight cis white couple.
Yeah.
Um, so sometimes you get parents who were like, I don't know what the experience is like to be a minority in any way. And oh, I have the same exact thing I'm drinking out of right now. Um,
Gotta hydrate.
yes, but yeah, there's resources online, but a lot of parents just really want to hear it directly from a person or have someone kind of hold their hand through it, which is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and I think especially for parents, like there's a lot of fear around it, like for their child and like what is going to happen and like are they going to be bullied? Are they going to have a quote unquote normal life? Like all these very natural fears that they like need someone to talk them through that. And I think it's
Yes.
also really important because parents can accidentally like project that shit onto their kids
Hmm.
and make the children's experience worse without realizing that like that's not the place for that. Like we need
Right.
to go outside of the parent-child relationship or caregiver-child relationship to express those feelings and those fears without like scaring your kid accidentally.
Yes. And another thing that's super relevant here is depending on how old the parents are, the way that the world is for queer people now is very different than the way it was when the parents were young. And I can say that, a lot of times the parents I work with are around the same age as I am, and I was a teenager in the 90s. So the fear that parents who may have been teens in the 90s have may not even be relevant for the queer youth experience nowadays because things change drastically with time and really,
Mhm.
really have in this area.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So I think maybe let's start by talking about kind of like queer identity development in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
timeline and like what you might expect. Like if you're having kids and your kids might come out to you as queer, trans, something like that, like what that could actually look like.
Yeah, so I will start with sexual orientation. So by the time children are preschoolers, they understand relationship roles. So they might see like, oh, there's a mom and a dad in this family, or there's two moms in this family, and two people are a couple. Like kids figure that stuff out quite young. And by the time kids are 7, they can begin identifying like who they are attracted to. And when I say that, I am very careful to say I'm not talking about sexual attraction in the way adults experience it. Not at all. What I'm referring to is just who we feel drawn to, who we want to spend time with, who we feel like makes us feel good. So we can probably all think about like first crushes in elementary school. Those aren't about sex. They're like, who do I want to be around? Who is
Yeah.
like good looking and makes me feel kind of giggly. So kids can identify those experiences around age 7. And then by age 10, kids know what sexual orientation words mean, and probably more often before age 10, depending on the family that they live in. Maybe if they're being raised in a family that is extremely conservative and doesn't want to talk about that stuff, they might not know.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that the world is in 2022 in America is a lot of kids are getting that information early, so they know what different sexual orientations are, which is why it is not unusual to have children knowing and coming out sometimes when they're around 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know, and you know, as people who did not come out as 10-year-olds, that that's not everybody's experience.
Right.
Um, it used to be that the average age that a person came out as queer, and I'm not talking about trans, I'm talking about queer. The
Mm-hmm.
average age of the person came out as queer used to be in their early 20s. And that was because that was the time that people broke away from their families, maybe went to school. And now people are coming out at younger and younger ages precisely because of the visibility. Um, One of the things that I think it's important to emphasize is that God, I really lost my train of thought on that one. Hold on a second. Um, oh yeah, one of the things that I think it's important to emphasize is that if a child says when they're 10, say you have a female assigned child, cisgender kid says, I'm into girls. I know I'm into girls. A lot of people's initial response will be that you can't know that. There's no way you know that. But the thing is, if you say to an adult straight person, when did you know you were straight? They're like, oh, actually, it's just a thing I always knew. And I'm like, so did you know you were straight when you were 10, 11, 12? And they're always like, well, yeah. Because to them, to all of us, it's just a normative thing to like be attracted to, if you're straight, what you perceive to be the opposite gender is you. And that's something that people really have a hard time wrapping their head around, that kids could identify attraction to others so early, but it's absolutely a possibility. So if you do have a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old that says, Mom, I know that I like, girls, or I know I like boys, or I know I like all different kinds of genders.
Mm-hmm.
That's not your kid acting older than their age. That's not your kid making shit up. It's like this, it's a real experience. And I know that's a new thing in this world, because it didn't used to be that people had the language or the space or the room to make those assertions when they were as young as they are
Yeah.
now. Before I go into gender identity development, do you have any like questions about that part, or do you want to talk about that part at all?
So it's funny when you're saying that. One of the things I just want to point out for anyone who's watching is, especially for those of us who are adults and many of us who came out later, like there's this idea of you can't know who you're attracted to until like you've had sex with that
Yeah,
gender, right? And
right.
so I just want to point out what you just said again, which is that we don't have the same expectation or requirement for straight people.
Never.
We do not tell straight people, oh, well, you didn't know you were straight until you actually had sex and confirmed that,
Hmm.
right? No,
Yep.
it's just because like that's what we see as normative and we see queer people as other, that we're like, oh, we need to have some requirements to make sure that you're really sure you fit into that
Right, right.
category.
Because it's like, yeah, we need proof. But there is no tangible proof. It's just like you feel it, you know it. I mean, I know it, you know it, queer kids know it.
Right.
And also, I think it's also important to give people room to grow and change. I know a lot
Yeah.
of parents want to know, but if my kid's telling me they're gay at 10, like what if they don't know? Are they going to be the same forever? And the truth is, we don't know that about any human being.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was 10, I probably assumed that I was straight. I mean, even though I like loved my best girlfriends more than any other people, but it wasn't even an option to not be straight. So I think that asking and wondering, is this going to be my kid's identity forever, is kind of missing the point. It might be, it might not be. What's my identity now in my 40s might not be my identity in 10 years. So I think that with any human, regardless of their age and regardless of whether there are children or not, we have to give them the room to understand things about their identity as they begin to understand those things themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay if maybe in 5 years your 15-year-old is like, you know what, actually, I think I'm bi. Like, okay, then go with that, you know? Fluidity is a real thing. And understanding more about yourself as those kind of windows and doors open to you is really normal. So don't get caught up in wondering if your kid is going to stay the same sexual identity that they shared they are with you when they're like in middle school or high school.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're going to get into like some of the practical ways that parents can like be affirming and supportive, but just to that point, I think as a parent or anyone who works with or spends time with kids, like it's important to let them know that like it's okay if they whatever they feel now, if it changes, that's fine. Like
Mm-hmm.
if they decide a different label fits better for them later, or like at this point they're attracted to this group, but maybe that shifts, like that's okay. Like it would have meant the world to me and so many queer people I know to have heard that growing
Yeah.
up. That like, you know, it's you don't have to put yourself into these boxes. Like you're allowed to change, you're allowed to grow, like keep checking in with yourself and like whatever you tell me is true for you, like I'm gonna believe that
Yes.
instead of like I have to question it because it's different from what it was before. Like I just
Yeah.
want more of that messaging out in the world.
Totally. And honestly, that's the experience I had with my family, even though I didn't come out as queer to my family until I was in my mid 20s. Since that time, I came out as, first it was like a lesbian, and then it was bi and queer, and like I brought home all different kinds of partners of all different kinds of genders, and never once did my parents ask me to make up my mind. Never once did they say, are you sure? They never fucking cared. They were always just like, is this person cool to you? Cool. um and as a woman, as an adult, that's the kind of love and support I need from my parents, and young kids need it just as much, if not more. They need to know they have that safe place to land.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go into gender identity then.
Yeah. So, okay. So I want to state that I work at a gender clinic for youth, and I am not a medical person. My role is as a support person for families and young people. But these are the things that I have observed in my years of working at what is one of the best gender clinics for young people in the country, in the United States. So at this point, our gender clinic has been open since, I don't know, 2014, and we have over 3,000 families that have come to us. And yeah, it's immense. We've had to open like other locations, hire new people, expand. There's so many folks bringing their young people to us. So, gender identity development in children. By the time kids are toddlers, like two, they understand that there are physical differences between sexes. So they would see, like, say they're in a mother-father household, or they have a brother, they're a cis girl. They know that like people that are boys are supposed to have a penis. People that are girls are supposed to have a vulva. Like, we know that there are differences between boys and girls.
Mhm.
Um, and by age, let me see. So that's happening by like toddlerhood. Um, then children understand that gender identity is like a stable thing. They know that like if someone's a girl, they're a girl the next day, they're a girl the day after that. Like it's like a permanence thing. They
Mhm.
also understand which one they're supposed to be because we give that messaging to kids super early. I mean, we are now giving it before they're even born with like a gender reveal party. So we're immediately coding them sometimes from the fetal stage, right? We're like, this baby has a vulva. That to us means the baby's a girl, and we're going to immediately start treating the baby like a girl, even if we're not conscious that we're doing that. A lot of people are very conscious of it, like pink, blue, all that stuff. But children know very early, like if you would go to a room of preschoolers and say, line up boys on one side and girls on the other, kids know which one they know which line they're supposed to be
Yeah.
in. So some children do start expressing a gender that's different than their assigned sex when they're very little, sometimes when they're two. This is not every trans person's experience. So I want to make it clear that, like, just like sexuality, an understanding of your gender can change throughout your lifetime as the information becomes available to you, as you're able to receive that information, depending on where you are in your life. Um, but it's absolutely possible for a very small child to express that they are not the sex they were assigned,
Mhm.
that their gender identity does not align with that sex. So when we have young people whose parents bring them to the gender clinic at the children's hospital, that usually means that their parents listen to them and that they're affirming them in some way. It might not mean they're affirming them in every way, but it at least means that the parents are like, oh, okay, like I had a baby that I thought was a girl, and now at age 4, this baby is really telling me, Mom, I'm not a girl. Mom, I'm not a girl. So they bring the child to the gender clinic. And when a kid is that little, there's really not much to do about it, except for just let them express their gender in a way that's comfortable for them.
Right.
So, depending on the kid, yeah, gender expression. So, like, what are they comfortable wearing? What kind of hairdo do they want? Letting them explore gender expression regardless of assigned sex. And some parents have trouble with that, not because the parents are shitty, but because, again, like I said, if we're talking about like a cis normative heteronormative couple that has no experience with queerness, sometimes they're like, well, if my girl's saying that she's a boy, then why does she want to sometimes wear girl things? And so we really have
Mhm.
to get parents to think critically about gender and deconstruct everything they know about gender, because their kids are probably going to be way more advanced than them at
Right.
having an opened mind about gender, because that's how things are headed,
Right.
a thing that's really interesting to me is that when we see studies that are saying now 1 in 6 Gen Z people are queer, those studies are not about Gen Z teens, and they're not about small children that are around alive now. They're about Gen Z adults, so people that are
Mhm.
ages 18 to 23. So if you take into account what is the sexuality and gender of people younger than 18, we don't even have those numbers yet. And things are trending queer and queer and queer. So
Amen.
I don't know if you've ever seen, there's like a graph that I use when I do presentations that shows the amount of adult Americans who openly identified as LGBT based on generation. And it goes back as far as folks that were the parents of boomers. So, like people like my grandparents who are no longer with us. The amount of folks in that generation that were comfortable openly identifying as LGBT was like 1.8% of the population. And then every generation since, it's increased. It would like double with the boomers and then double again with Gen X. And then millennials were even more. And then Gen Z is like even more people identifying as queer. But like I said, that's only Gen Z adults. So when we look at young people that are under the age of 18, there's no doubt that once there is finally some kind of research, we're going to see that the numbers just keep going up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is very exciting.
Very exciting.
The more of us who are out there, the better. And as both you and I know, it's not that people weren't queer before. It's that it was far less safe to be queer, to be openly queer, that you would not want to respond to a survey saying that you were. You wouldn't want to act on it.
And I mean, I think of all of the people who are no longer alive, who were various shades of queer in previous past generations, who did not have the language we have now for identity, who did not have the luxury of thinking that deeply about their gender and sexuality, because it was like, I mean, a thing that I think it's fascinating to me as someone who works in the sexuality world and studies sexuality is that our modern conceptualizations of gender identity and sexual orientation are so different than what was available to people in past generations. So like we can say things now like I'm non-binary and I'm ace and I'm demisexual and I, you know, sometimes flirt with being, I don't know, like other identity words that had not even been created or thought up.
Yeah.
So we're like, there's so many reasons why there are more openly queer people now, especially children. And it has to do with the internet, the connectivity we have. So like when I was a teenager, say it's like 1995 and I'm here in rural Pennsylvania, I didn't know where to find queer people. It was like the internet was a baby, you know, there wasn't social media. There was like, I mean, that's like before I even had AOL, you know? So nowadays, we are all so connected that the access to that information has really, really changed the way people are able to see themselves and see themselves reflected in the world around them.
Absolutely. The representation is, I mean, we obviously still need more of it. We always will, but it is so much more than it used to be. And I think that for myself too, you know, as someone who didn't come out as bi until my late 20s and then didn't come out as a lesbian until my 30s, like how different it would be to grow up in the world today with like all of these things that were.
Oh my God. Did you hear the dog?
Yes.
Cooper. Golden Retrievers on alert. Excuse them. They agree with you. Cooper.
They're great allies.
They are great allies. But like, to your point, sometimes I think like if lesbian TikTok had been a thing that I could scroll as a 15-year-old, holy shit. Holy shit.
You know how many people have told me that lesbian TikTok was like their freaking gay awakening, myself included? Like over the pandemic, I was like, I'm way more into women than I realized.
Yes. And that is like just one tiny piece of all of the things that people are experiencing now. They can see themselves reflected in, so I mean, social media creates the ability for us to not only see other people, but it allows us to create content where we can put our image out there. And so it's not just like famous people. We're not just having access to like people that want to be known. We're having access to all kinds of different identities. And that is really, I mean, it just opens people's minds. So, sir, so sorry. I know that this will go up on our Instagrams and then people are going to be like, what the hell? But everyone knows we're dog ladies. Okay?
Yeah, like anyone out there with dogs is like, yeah, this is par for the course.
Right, and they know that you and I are both from multiple dog households. So
exactly.
This is what happens.
This is just
it's kind of like how children interrupt people on lives. It's
you
know, it's life.
It's the same. So
thing,
with social, I think that one of the things that's interesting too, not to take us off topic much further, but with people being able to make their own content, right? You kind of made that difference between like celebrities, people who want to be seen versus like the average person who wants to make their own content. That allows them to be seen by their own gaze as well, because I think
Yes.
a lot of the representation that we did have and even still have is like queerness through the lens of like still the male gaze and
Mm-hmm.
still like a writer's room
Uh-huh.
that is not queer people.
And
And
cis,
so
predominantly cis, for
right,
sure.
right. A lot of cis people. So like if you're a queer or trans person and that's the representation, you still might be like, oh, maybe I don't, identify with that. I don't see
Mm-hmm.
myself in that, because it's still not quite the right lens. Versus like when people are creating their own content and they're just showing up as themselves authentically, they can be a much stronger connection with that kind of content because they're
Absolutely.
real people and you're like, oh, this is very different from this other version of queerness that like was painted for me in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing that I was about to say is very related. There was an article in the Washington Post last year about how now like 1 in 6 young adults identify as LGBT, and it used the example of one person that was like a, I don't know, a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old non-binary person that they interviewed, and that kid was like, "Oh yeah, like gay marriage got legalized when I was 8, and I just grew up around queer people, and they taught about gender identity at my school, and most of my friends are queer in some way." So it's like that is not the environment that I grew up in.
Oh.
It's not the environment you grew up in, and it's not turning people gay, it's allowing people to see and conceptualize themselves in ways that were unavailable to you and I.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there is a gigantic community of late bloomer lesbians on the internet, of people who married men, had children with men, all these other things, because they like just never realized it was possible for them to be
Yep.
anything else but that life, like that was
Yep.
given to them. And I'm a living example of that as well. But I was,
I swear, like 8 out of 10 people that work with me fit into that example as well. I'm always like, y'all are in really good company.
yes, like there, I mean, when you go through it initially, you're like, how did I miss this? I'm the only one. And then you go on the internet and you're like, there are communities of thousands of people going through the
Yes.
exact same thing, because like patriarchy is strong, compulsory heterosexuality is strong, like all
Yep.
these things were so much stronger for our generation because we didn't get what kids today are getting. Nobody in my school was talking about any of that stuff. I went to public school in Texas. You know what we had? We had abstinence only sex education and literally
Mm-hmm.
zero mention of queerness.
Yep. Honestly, one of the first things I start with when I do a presentation to adults about LGBTQ kids is I say, anyone want to volunteer when you were in high school? Like, what decade were you in high school? And, usually the oldest person in the room will be like, I was in high school in like the 70s or something. And I'll say, okay, were there any out queer people in your school? Were there any out trans people in your school? Did you know the word non binary in the 70s? And, that shit works even if you talk to someone that was in high school in like 2010.
Yeah, all of those I could the same way. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And it's just, I mean, queer youth are a lot of the population, and this population is going to continue to grow. Um, yeah. So it's like a thing that young people, or a thing that parents can't ignore, which is why I think it's so important to think like if you wouldn't support a queer kid, then you're probably not making a good decision about being a parent,
Mm-hmm.
because the chances
Mm-hmm.
of having a queer or trans child are growing and they're not stopping anytime soon. And you can't make a kid straight. You can't make a kid straight. You can't just think your kid's going to be straight because you and your husband are straight, or because you were raising them in a conservative environment. Let me hear it from all the fucking queer people raised in evangelical religions out there. Like,
Yeah, doesn't change anything, just makes you have
no.
a lot of shame about yourself.
Yeah, and you got to claw your way up harder to come out on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for parents, caregivers, anyone listening, we want to give them some ideas of like how they can best support and be affirming to the children in their lives who are queer and trans. So I think let's start with just like, if a kid comes out to you if they tell you they're queer in some way, or they tell you they're trans, they don't feel like they are the gender that you think they are, where do we go from there?
Yes. So, first of all, I want folks, if you're a parent or a caregiver, to know that it takes a lot of guts usually for a child to come out to their parents. Um, there's even been a study that came out last year, I believe, that showed that trans youth experience the most distress in the 6 months leading up to when they come out to their families. So, like, it's not a small thing if a child comes out to you, it's an honor. It means they want you to know this information. It's important to them that you know this information. And the way that my parents reacted when I came out was ideal. They were like, "We love you no matter what." And that's what people need to hear. That's what kids need to hear. And I also think it's really important to emphasize, especially when it comes to parents of young children. You might be in your 40s, 30s, and your kids are coming out and they're using language that was not something that you even knew existed. You don't have to understand your kids' gender and sexuality to support them. Even if you're like, it makes no sense to me why my kid is sometimes expressing their gender in this way and then sometimes expressing it in a different way. You don't have to know exactly what that means. You just have to support your child no matter what, even if you don't understand them. So I think it can be really powerful to say, like, I love you no matter what. You'll always be my child. I will protect you. I will support you. You can be yourself with me. You are safe with me. Even if you don't understand your child's gender, even if you don't completely, I mean, how can we truly understand any identity but our own, in a
Mm-hmm.
way? But just letting your kid know that your home is always going to be the safe place for them to land. And the reason that's important is because, I mean, decades of statistics will show that young people that come out to supportive families have more positive, like, health and social outcomes than people that experience family rejection. And we see that in mental health, we see that in homelessness, we see that in contact with the criminal justice system, we see that in poverty, like, we see that in substance abuse. So, like, a protective factor for queer people is having a supportive family. And you want your kid to know that no matter what they face out in the world, that you are a home that is safe for them.
Yes, that is like seriously like number one. I've had this conversation with a lot of clients who have kids who come out to them where I'm like, at the end of the day, if you do nothing else, like that is the most important thing to express to your kid, because you can't control what happens outside of your house. As a parent or caregiver, you really want to, but
Yeah.
you can't. They're going to face some shitty things and some wonderful things and all kinds of stuff. But it is so much easier for them to face those things and go through those things if they know that you have their back. So
Yes.
you can find whatever way you can to let them know you will always have their back. It doesn't matter how they ultimately identify or what labels they use, that like you're gonna love them and you're gonna support them. Just knowing that one person, and especially someone as important as a parent or caregiver, has your back in that way truly makes all the difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you don't have to be in, like I said, you don't have to be a queer parent yourself to support a queer kid. You don't have to know everything about the queer community to support a queer kid. What we need is you to respect us, even if you don't understand, and support and love us. I mean, it's truly boils down to that. Um, Another thing that I wanted to share, hold on, I'm like losing track. I have so many thoughts, which is why I keep getting them jumbled. Um, oh, I think that all parents should know that it's, and this is maybe kind of a hot take. I know it's a hot take for some people, but if you experience a sliver of disappointment, you're not a terrible person. If you experience a brief flash of being like, oh, this is hard, or even if if you have to mourn the idea that you had about your child's future that
Mm-hmm.
might not look the way you thought it would, that doesn't mean you're a shitty parent. I think those feelings are valid and you need to deal with them, but not at your child, which is a thing that you already said. But like I run support groups for parents of queer youth. And one of the things that we tell them is like, this group is where you can say that stuff. We
Yeah.
don't, you know, you're not supposed to come in this group and pretend that you've never felt an ounce of grief over your child's gender or sexual identity. This group is where you can say, like, I have grief, and having that grief doesn't make you a shitty parent. I think it makes you human.
Mm-hmm.
Because then if you experience grief that your kid is queer, you're going to heap shame on top of that grief, and that's not helpful either. So, like, if you do have a moment of being like, this is going to be hard, now I'm losing the idea of my child I thought I had, just fucking own those feelings. Talk to your therapist. Talk to your therapist, talk to your friends, talk to your partner, talk to other parents of queer kids. Just don't tell your kid. That's the difference. But you can't be expected to not feel any kind of struggle. Maybe some of us don't. Maybe some of us are like, oh, wonderful. But a lot of parents are going to feel conflicted, and they are going to feel some difficult feelings. And I don't think that means that you're a bad parent. I think you just have to deal with those.
Well, and we all grow up in the same world with,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the same influences and systems in place and expectations and ideas of like what a good life is for a child and what like an easier life will be for a child. And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, nobody goes into parenting without all of those.
Ah, sorry. A dog's eating my sock. A golden retriever is eating my sock.
This is the most like dog moment ever that's
Excuse
happening
me.
right now.
Excuse me. Oh my God.
You know, we
Do you
all
see
need a
this?
golden retriever sock stealing
This
moment.
golden retriever just ate my sock.
Oh my god, how rude.
Yeah, what a sir.
Look, as a lab parent, I can tell you that golden retrievers and labs are like the demons of the dog world. They're
They really
adorable, they're
are.
so sweet, but they are the problem
They're
children.
sneaky. I'm like, I'm not paying attention to you for like 1 minute and you eat my sock.
How dare.
Anyhow, I feel like we were about to make a really good point. And I don't
Yeah,
remember
what
what it
was
was.
I saying? Let's see what we were talking about. Parents. Oh yes, I was talking about how we all grew up with all of that same
Yes.
stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
so I too would be surprised if a parent didn't have a mix of feelings. You
Yes.
know, when a child is again coming out to them as queer, coming out to them as trans, especially if that parent is not queer or trans themselves, maybe hasn't had much interaction with queer and trans people, and don't know anything about the community. Like all of a sudden it's like this is a whole new world. And
It is a
especially
whole
as
new world.
adults, we really like to be competent. And so basically being told, hey, you're actually going to be incompetent in this right now,
Uh-huh.
that's scary. That's like, well, what the fuck am I going to do with this? I'm used to like at least having some sense of what to do and what's going on, and now everything
Yes.
got harder.
You're absolutely right on all of that. And I would also add that if you are concerned about what the grandparents are going to say, that's extra layers of hard. So I've worked with a lot of clients who are deconstructed from evangelicism, sorry. And they're like, well, I support my non-binary 11-year-old, but how do I tell my grandparents? Or I'm sorry, how do I tell my parents who are still
Fair.
very conservative that my child is non-binary and that I support my child? And that can be one of the most challenging things for people is like, because some of them know that if I tell my parents that I support my child's non-binary gender, my parents are going to say that I'm being a bad parent. And so what that usually requires is setting a lot of boundaries with your own parents. So telling them like, I am raising my child, you've already raised me, and I support my child in whatever they tell me that their gender identity is. And I cannot, have you as grandparents not supporting them and not supporting me. So you need to think about as grandparents if you still want to have a relationship with us. And hopefully it does not come to that, but I have seen that kind of dynamic play out before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is going back to what you were saying about how the parent caregiver in question here like needs to be the safe place to land, because sometimes those dynamics do happen. I've also had that happen with clients where they're like, I'm really worried about other family and what they're going to do. And, you know, if I should just kind of remove us from the situation. And I'm like, well, you need to do whatever is the thing that champions your child and their
Yeah.
identity, whatever, because you can't control how these other people react. But like, your child needs to see that you're fighting for them
Hmm.
and that like you're doing whatever you can to keep them safe. That's the most important thing. And that sucks. It sucks when like some other relationships in the family may be negatively affected, or like you said, may even have to be cut off. But like, it is this kid's
Yeah.
well-being that is should be the number one priority in those situations.
Yes, you're totally right. And I hate when it has to come to that for people. But sometimes, you know, the kindest and most protective thing you can do for your LGBT child is make sure that the folks around them, that, you know, in the family are showing them the respect and love that you're showing them. And that can also mean, I mean, I have a friend who recently had to send an email to her family that was like, hey, my 11-year-old uses they them pronouns. It doesn't matter if you understand, but you need to know this is happening. And it's not, grandparents might not always understand, but also I want to give them credit. A lot of them really have the capacity to love and understand their grandchildren better than they could have loved and understood their own kids. Um, at the gender clinic, we have a support group for grandparents of transgender youth, and they are the most fierce, loyal allies. They get together and they call themselves the trans grands, which is the cutest thing in the
Oh
world.
my
And
god.
these grandparents are like, I mean, we're talking people that are in their, I mean, I don't, you can become a grandparent young, but a lot of these are folks that are in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. And they didn't have a lot of, it's not like they had a lot of knowledge about trans folks before their grandchild came out.
Mm-hmm.
And they are such fierce, like, fighters for their grandkids because they know what love is and they know what care is, and they love these kids no matter what. And they
Mm-hmm.
will be the first person at their church to be like, my grandchild's trans and I support them. And so, you know, I don't want to discount that there are a lot of folks from previous generations that really have the capacity for love and understanding of like gender diverse and queer kids, because there absolutely are.
Mm-hmm. So beyond kind of that initial coming out, the first stages of things, do you have any other thoughts about supporting your queer kids, like, you know, as they're getting older, maybe moving into like middle school, high school age years? Like, what does good support look like from parents?
Good support looks like not only championing them in your home, but it's sometimes, depending on where they go to school, can look like paying close attention to the school that they're in. Um, Sometimes, I mean, parents of trans youth already know this stuff, but it might require like having a conversation or a meeting with school personnel. Um, you know, so that the people that are in charge of your children's education are affirming and supportive. Um, it also means being open to your children's gender identity and sexual identity evolving and changing as their own knowledge about themselves evolves. So, like we said at the very beginning of this, for folks that might just be joining us, um, if your 10-year-old comes out to you, that sure, it might not mean that they're always going to have the identity that they told you when they were a kid, but it doesn't matter. As long, you just have to be kind of open to hearing them, and growing with them. Um,
Thank you. Dog therapy for everybody.
Dog therapy for everybody.
Even if you have been stealing socks and causing a ruckus.
This isn't the sock stealer. That's the sock
Okay.
stealer over there. This is the good girl.
The sock
She's the
stealers
good
put
girl.
themselves in timeout.
Hmm. Yeah, so that means like expanding the, so you like support your kid in your home, and it also means kind of extending that support outwards to where your children spend their time, making sure that like, they're finding queer friends and community. Depending on where they live, that can be difficult, but a lot of places now have supportive groups for children who are especially trans youth, or maybe just consider themselves LGBT in any shade of the rainbow.
Mhm.
Yeah, also making sure they have access to good sex education that's inclusive of
Yes.
their identities, because if they're in Texas public school, they're not going to get that. If they're in Pennsylvania public school, they're not going to get that, probably, depending on the district. So giving your kids education about their bodies and their relationships that
Mhm.
includes them.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I was thinking about when it comes to like kind of supporting your kids, especially growing into teenage years, is how most parents have these like ideas and assumptions about like how they'll raise their kids during those years on the assumption that they will be cis and straight, right? In terms of
Mm-hmm.
like dating and like what the rules are going to be and like the
Mm-hmm.
sex and these other things we're talking about, and how parents actually like, especially now knowing that we do have so many people who are queer and trans, like this is something to be thinking about if you're going to become a parent or if you have young kids right now. Like if you take away the heteronormative like dating and sex expectation, what does it look like to parent around that, for your kids? If they're going to
Yeah.
be dating a variety of genders, if they might be having
Mm-hmm.
sex with a variety of genders, if, they are going to be trans themselves and how that can affect dating in the world that we live in. Like just things that I think parents, when they assume their kids are going to be straight, we just ignore all of that.
Right, especially things like sleepovers and, having
Yeah.
friends stay at their. I've done so many like parent consultations about like sleepovers. Parents will be like, "Well, I don't know, my kid is queer and they have like a little queer friend that's." And I'm like, "Are they in a romantic relationship? If your kid is in a romantic relationship with another person, treat them, you know, they don't get a special pass to have like overnight visitors just because they might be a queer kid. Like
Right.
how would you parent a straight cis kid in this situation? Sometimes that can be your answer.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, a lot of parents are going to be entering new territory, and that can be very scary, but you will figure it out as you go, because isn't that how a lot of parenting works anyways? Like
Right.
people just figure shit out as they go.
Yeah, it is. I think some of it is just like the awareness piece is what's important, is like the realization of like, oh, there are things I didn't plan for that I didn't know. And now
Mm-hmm.
I need to go get the resources or talk to somebody, like we've said, find support. Like, thankfully, we're living in a world now where that stuff's available. Like, the internet is full of things that can be helpful for you. There are a lot of professionals who you could work with who could help you if you're like, I don't know. The same way that you would
Yeah.
hire somebody for something else you were dealing with as a parent, like you can hire somebody or buy a book or a resource about something like this too, to just make sure
Right.
you understand. Like doing that versus ignoring it is what I feel like matters the most.
Totally. And like nobody teaches you this stuff when you go to your like birthing classes, Nobody's
No.
like, well, what's going to happen when your child comes out as non-binary when they're 10? You're going to be on a learning curve like all the other parents were. But increasingly, like you said, there are more and more resources out there from people that have already walked this path. And sex positive families is always an incredible resource that I promote. Like
Yes.
I will promote them forever. There's also a website called mykidisgay.com.
Ooh.
And My Kid Is Gay, it's specifically for like Christian parents or parents that were raised Christian. And it's written by like really wonderful, loving, affirming Christian parents. And I send people to that website a lot. Like there will be articles that are like, my kid is trans, my kid is non-binary, this is what I've learned. And that kind of, those voices are really important, and they're already out there.
Okay, awesome. I didn't know that existed, and now I'm
Mm-hmm.
filing that away into my brain because I think that it would be a very important resource to send to people.
Totally.
Any other ones that you want to mention? Any books or anything that you found helpful with your parents and caregivers you worked with?
um I want to promote a book that is a puberty education book that is fully inclusive of various genders and sexual identities. It's called The Every Body Book by Rachel Simon. Rachel Simon is a colleague of mine and a friend of mine, and she wrote this book. It came out last year. It's an incredible book. And if you are, wanting to teach children about bodies and puberty, and you don't want to do it from an entirely like cis-normative, heteronormative perspective, that is the book. That's actually the reason. So you probably saw that a couple weeks ago, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene was like, straight people are being bred out of existence. There's not going to be straight people. She said it in response to the existence of my friend's book.
What?
Yeah.
Your friend is doing incredible work in the world.
She is. She's amazing.
Got Marjorie Taylor Greene's attention, then.
I know. Yeah. So that book is incredible. And also, like, the thing about sex positive families is on their website, they have resources and books that you can look at and find based on topic. So books to talk to children about gender and sexuality, to help your children see themselves in the stories that they're reading when they're kids. I know that organizations, like big organizations like the HRC, they have a lot of resources about being a supportive parent. That's what PFLAG was made for, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. Even though the acronym is old, they are still keeping up to speed on gender stuff. So it's not just for parents of lesbians and gays. I would say parents of sexual and gender minority youth. And even if it's hard to find people in your area, that's the wonder of being connected online, is that you will be able to find parents of young people who are going through the same thing, and maybe who have experience that you don't have.
The one thing I want to add here too is, I know this is about supporting queer youth specifically, but also if you're someone who is regularly around children, whether it's your own kids' friends or like you work with people, you don't necessarily know who is queer in that group of people, and you should operate on the assumption that at any point you may be around queer children. And so in the language that you're using, in, like you were saying, the like children's books that you're reading, where you're offering up different perspectives of what different families can look like and relationships can look like, and the toys that you offer to kids, like all of these different things like you can do to be affirming of queer identities, even if it's not your own child who has come out to you or whatever comes out to you. Like, your kid is probably going to have queer kids around them. This is just a statistical reality. And so I think any parent, even if it's not your own child or anybody who works with kids, even if you don't know for sure that somebody is queer, that somebody is trans, chances are you're working with people who are. So if you can be someone who is affirming of their identities, because you have no idea how affirming other adults in their lives are being of their identities, like, it makes such a big difference.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that. That's one of the things that I emphasize when I do trainings with folks about like supporting queer and trans youth, is like, ideally a parent or a guardian or caregiver fills the role of supportive adult. But especially if the kid doesn't have that, other adults step in to fill that role. And that can be teachers, coaches, other family members, elder siblings. Like, every young queer person needs a supportive adult. Ideally, it's a family member, but if it can't be, I think we all have an opportunity as adults to be that person. And that makes such a difference for kids.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this, Erica. I'm so glad we got to talk about this. Is there anything you want to rep or say about your work, or where people can find you before we sign off?
Yeah. So my Instagram account, which is right here, is probably like the hub of all my business. My website is purityculturedropout.com. My work with trans youth is pretty specific to my region and area in Philadelphia, but I also do like one-on-one work with parents virtually anywhere. So yeah, happy to support people in whatever way that I can.
Yeah, and as someone who has sent people to you who all had wonderful experiences and were like, thank you so much for hooking me up, I can vouch for Erica as an amazing consultant. If you are like, just have questions, you want to talk more deeply about this stuff, or to your specific situation with your kid or a kid in your life, Erica is wonderful for that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to her.
Thank you so much for having me on this lovely evening.
Of course, thank you.
Last Wednesday, last week of Pride Month. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, we're in the home stretch. The gays are tired.
Especially the gays like you have been like really keeping up the energy for the rest of us.
Yes, I love it, but it's a lot.
Oh, thank you. Someone just said something very sweet in the comments. Thank you so
I
much,
see that.
Kelly.
Yay.
Oh,
All
here's
right, well,
here's
for anyone
a
who
last
came on
view of
late,
a last
yeah,
view of
last dog view. And this whole conversation is going to be posted after. So if you missed the beginning, you want to go back and watch it, you can. I'm also going to get a transcript made of our conversation, and I'll put the video and the full transcript on my blog so that people can read it as well if they'd like to.
Thank you. That's really awesome. Even though I sometimes stumbled over my words as we do on a live, but I think it's great that you're making it a transcript available for folks.
Absolutely. My favorite part will be describing the dog shenanigans that are happening in brackets in the
A
transcripts.
dog just ate a sock.
All right, Erica, I hope you have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you everyone who joined us.
Thank you so much, Shorey. I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Good night.
Bye.